What's up, Packers fans? Aaron Negler here with Cheesehead TV. I'm joined by Diante Lee of The Athletic, who has a great piece about defensive fits scheme-wise from the draft. He covers the draft for The Athletic. You can find his piece in the description of this video. Diante, thanks so much for joining me today, man.
And thank you for making the time. I've obviously been following your work, Peter's work, who does Locked On Packers. Obviously, Justice
Right.
Mosqueda is a very close associate of mine. So glad to be talking Packers. I think I'm probably going to be touching on quite a few of you guys' platforms in the
Right.
coming days to talk about Quay Walker. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, that was the thing. Your piece highlighted what you considered the best scheme fits as far as, you highlighted like 5 or 6 guys, I think, and Walker
Mhm.
was one of them. And I was kind of fascinated by what you wrote, particularly. I mean, I think everybody who, Packers fans, you see a guy get drafted, you automatically go watch, YouTube highlights or whatever.
Right.
But there's something that you wrote that I found really interesting in regards to his kind of ability to kind of walk out when offenses like to spread things around, because that's something the Packers have struggled with when teams like to
Mhm.
go to like the spread stuff, the empty kind of formations. As far as matchups go, the Packers have struggled there. And how do you feel, or how do you see that working with Walker and Devondre Campbell staying on the field, which is something they've talked about?
I think that that's kind of where I wanted to start is with Devondre Campbell. Coming into 2022, I think there were just questions in general about what the second level of the Packers defense was going to look like, whether or not Devondre Campbell was going to be ready to take that next step and really be a dependable every down level of player. And I think that he proved that he was able to do so, right? We definitely saw him being used to, I think, his strengths with Joe Barry, which is a credit to him. And then I think we saw some of the things that he might still have a little bit of a gap in his game with. And that comes to, hey, can you walk out into space and deal with tight ends who are athletic enough to really
Right.
punish you in those intermediate areas? Can you deal with, that fourth receiver, that extra slot? If they get into those 10 personnel looks. And it's not just him. I think that was just their linebacker room in general. They kind of cycled through guys. And that was something that our guy Justice Mosqueda kind of talked about when he was discussing Quay Walker, right? Or was trying to talk about finding that next backer to play with Devondre, so that way he can do what he does best, which is staying in the box, fitting the run, dealing with running backs. And I think that that's what Quay Walker gives you, is another dependable piece that you can use with all these different personnel groupings that we know that the Packers have, especially given the fact that they're so talented in the defensive backfield and they can
Right.
do so many different things, up front. I think that now that you have a guy like Quay Walker, the best version of him really allows you to put your best 11 players on the field, regardless of what the offense is doing, and feel safe that there's no real mismatches for an offense to go and pick on. So that's what I think, from a 10,000 foot view that you get with Quay Walker is just that ability to really be able to match up and take away any of those kind of issue areas that we've typically seen with the Packers defense.
Well, it's interesting too, because I think a lot of Packers fans were surprised at a linebacker being selected. Now, clearly, the
Right.
Packers love this kid and they love his ability and the idea of locking him up long term on a cheap deal to go
Mhm.
along with Devondre Campbell, who they obviously signed to a pretty significant contract. I
Right.
noticed in your last mock, I think it was your last mock, you had the Packers taking a linebacker. You had it
Mhm.
happening at 28, and it
Right.
was Kobe Dean, I think, still another
Mhm.
Georgia guy. What's the difference between those two as far as you're looking at Walker's game versus Dean's game? As someone who watches zero college football, I mean, you
Right.
could throw any guy on tape, and I'm like, yeah, that's a fast Georgia guy, all right. But what are maybe some of the finer things that you think maybe the Packers saw in Walker over the rest of the field when it came to that linebacker position?
Well, I think like the number one thing, and this isn't really particular to Green Bay, but I do think it's pretty instructive when you talk about them in the draft, is they have very serious thresholds when it comes to like height, weight, speed,
Truly,
size
right,
metrics, right? Like
right,
there are certain guys that can go be stars anywhere else in the NFL that would just never cross the radar of the Packers front office, right? They want certain body types in certain spots. So number one, that's what you get. And I think that that's also instructive when you look at the way that they played last year, right? I think I make mention of it every time I talk about the Packers, and it's just how enormous they are up front, right?
yes,
Between Rashawn
right,
Gary, Preston Smith,
right,
Kenny Clark, we go down the line, they play big. And I think that when you play that big up front, it does require you to have certain kinds of athletes behind them, right? That can go out and play in the second level and deal with those intermediate throwing windows, be able to play out in space when the ball bounces out wide, things like that. So that's what Quay Walker gives you. You see that in the 4.5 40 that he ran. He's 6'3", 240 pounds. He's got the arm length that you would like to see out of your prototypical linebacker. So just physically, you're getting the prototype that you want. And then from a skill set position, and this is something that I noted every time I watched Georgia play, was the more spread out offenses got, the more playing time Quay Walker saw. And then the more spread formations that they saw, the more that they trusted Quay of their linebackers to go step out and deal with that number 3 receiver in your trips formation. So that third receiver, that slot, something that the Packers are really familiar with, when Devontae Adams was here, that was something that they loved to do, was put him in the slot for the same reason that you go out and get a Quay Walker, right? Because the assumption is that, hey, whatever linebacker you have there can't, shine the shoes of your best wide receiver or your second best wide receiver if he's in the slot and matched up with that guy. So having the guy who has the height, weight, speed, and length metrics that you need to be able to play in those windows in general. And I think that, you look at the foot quickness, the lateral mobility, his ability to play comfortably out in zone coverage, which is another thing that's big with the Packers, right? Is being able to use quarters coverage, cover two, a combination of both to really be able to squeeze those intermediate windows. That's exactly the kind of player that Quay Walker is. And I'm not shocked after the fact. It did kind of catch me off guard that he was the linebacker taken for them, that they moved around in the draft to make sure that they were able to get to him. That was a shocker. But when you look at skill set versus scheme fit, it makes all the sense in the world. And all that shot kind of left me the second I gave it some thought. And now I kind of have a clear picture of what this defense is going to look like in 2022.
What's interesting, you mentioned how big they are up front. They certainly are, whether it's, that interior, whether it's the guys on the outside, what have you. One of the other guys that you mentioned in your piece who went to the Buccaneers, Hall, the defensive tackle, who was funny because that's who I had kind of earmarked as one of my draft crushes for the Packers. And it was interesting to see them go with Wyatt. Is there something there athletically that you think maybe fits the Packers scheme a little bit better, what they're asking these guys to do up front? Because as you say, they traditionally have like kind of not, just taken up blocks, but that is obviously a significant part of what they do. But Wyatt seems like such an athlete, like a guy who's going to have a really quick first step in a way that they haven't had a ton of in Green Bay.
I'm kind of fascinated to see whether or not they view Wyatt as that second defensive tackle in their nickel personnel to play alongside Kenny Clark. And this is something that I think that he made a lot of money for himself with this past season at Georgia, was showing that he could trim the weight. So he went down from being a 340, 350-pound guy to basically being right at 300, between 300 and 310 is what I heard this past year at Georgia. And then as he trimmed that weight down, you see that explosive first step, right? And that's a rare trait to get out of guys that size. And then he comes out, runs a sub 5, 40 at that height and weight, and now your ears are really perked up, right? And you go back and you watch the film and you see a guy who can move laterally. So now that opens up the door for all of like your stunts and twists that you might want to run up front. And, when you're just pinning your ears back and getting after the quarterback, that's a guy that I think has great hand usage. He's somebody who I do think you can use to kind of pick on guards with. And again, we start talking about within the Packers scheme, specifically in the guys who are off the Fangio tree, all the different fronts and personnel packages you use, they are very intentional with making sure that they have players in position that can take advantage of some things up front. And I think that Wyatt is that kind of skeleton key guy in between, from guard to guard that you can put anywhere and say, hey, he can fit the run as a 3 technique. He can fit the run as a nose. He can get after the quarterback in both of those positions. He can be a true defensive tackle in every sense of the word. And that's why, again, it's one of those things that makes a lot of sense to me. And you put him next to Kenny Clark and, good luck running the football into that, man. It's going to be really, really tough to deal with this team in between the tackles this year.
I'm glad you mentioned Fangio because I did want to kind of step back and look at this like 30,000 foot wise. As far as the scheme itself, we've talked a lot about what Joe Barry likes to do. And the fact that he comes out of that Fangio tree, right? What Staley was doing there in LA, and kind of this mold of this and you mentioned it, I think, in your piece, the too high safety being the majority of the looks you get. Now we saw them kind of throwing together some 3 safety stuff last year. I do think you probably don't get as much of that this year with Walker in the mix, but how do you see maybe not the evolution, because who knows what they really want to do there behind closed doors in the lab,
Mhm.
so to speak. But what do you think with the personnel they now have on hand? These two first round selections, bringing back all the guys they got with Douglas, and they got Campbell back in the mix, and you're getting Jair back from injury, etc. Do you see them being a really multiple defense, or do you think they kind of play their stuff pretty straight up and count on their athletes to do most of the work?
I would say the question I'm really looking to have answered is, where does Jair Alexander line up this next
Right.
year? You
Right.
know, if is he going to be, and we saw him coming back from injury. I think that part of it was, hey, while he's nursing himself back to health, let's kind of protect him and not put him
Yeah.
back out on the island by himself. And then I think they kind of stumbled into, hey, this guy might be a pretty good slot corner.
He
This
looked
might be a
really
guy
good
that
in that playoff game, no doubt about it.
absolutely. So,
Yeah.
that might be something that they want to, kind of key into going forward. And I do expect him to be multiple in that way. I think about him now that I've seen him play in the slot and play really well in the slot. You can kind of use him similarly to the way that the Rams use Jalen Ramsey, right? Which is that, hey, if there's
Right.
a problem that we have to deal with in the slot, maybe it's a guy who's too shifty for a Russell Douglas. Well, we've got a
Mhm.
Jair Alexander who can handle that without any problems. We can move him inside. Or if we're dealing with, a Justin Jefferson and he's lined up out on the outside, that's the guy we want matched up with him. We can kick him back outside and kind of reconfigure the personnel around it. So I do expect it to be a lot of what we saw in 2021 in terms of, hey, on a week by week basis, we're kind of closing our eyes, sticking our hand into a hat, and whatever
Right.
personnel package
Right.
we draw out is what we're rolling with on Sunday. I do expect a lot of that. And I think that their draft picks kind of reinforce that. That's why you go out and get a Devontae Wyatt. That's why you go out and get a Quay Walker. And another thing that Quay Walker does is he can line up on the edge sometimes and give you a little bit as a pass rusher too.
Yeah, I've been wondering about that because I've seen mentions of that in some
Mhm.
writing, but I haven't really gone. I just don't have the time to go look at
Right.
Georgia tape. I got
Right.
I got a life to live, Diante. But
Absolutely.
but I have seen people mention that. Do you think that's part of his skill set?
I do. I don't think that it's as big a piece as like Channing Tindall, who was his teammate at Georgia. He was often on the edge. I think Quay is
Right.
a better coverage player than he is a rusher or blitzer. But that is something that you can use. If you want to play with three linebackers, you want to get into like some 3-3-5 personnel or something to that effect, where you're playing with a lot of speed at the second level. That's a guy that you can do a lot of things with. So that just kind of opens the door again for you to really kind of hammer in the fact that no offense can show up to Lambeau Field with their best personnel package and feel like they can create problems for us defensively. And that all kind of ties into what they're doing schematically. If you want to play with two high safeties and 5 or more DBs on the field at a time, you've got to have the bodies up front that can deal with all the different kind of looks you're going
Right.
to see from an offense. And I think that they've got that. And the best version of this defense, I think, is going to be right up there in the top 3, in the NFL again. So that's exactly kind of what I expect to see. What we saw in the second half of the year where they were really humming in terms of coverage. And then you really
Right.
started to see guys like Rashawn Gary and Preston Smith really create a lot of problems in that way. I think that we see that same kind of symbiotic relationship where they're so good in coverage that their big bodies that aren't necessarily pure speed rushers have enough time to crush the pocket and affect the quarterback. And, one hand kind of feeding the other. That's exactly what I expect to see from them again this year.
Man, you got me all pumped up. I'm gonna go watch some Packers tape from last year and just get ready for this 2022 season.
Absolutely.
Diante, I can't thank you enough for taking some time and talk about your stuff at the Athletic. Make sure you check it out. Like I said, his article is in the description of this video. You can find the link there. Diante, thanks so much for the time, man.
Thank you, Aaron. Have a good one, man.